My father left me a personalized suicide note before he passed away. And while he certainly meant well, even up to his dying breath, he full-heartedly believed in fear-based, fundamentalist religion. In the letter, he said things like, "Keep believing in Jesus because I'm going to be looking for you in heaven and I don't want you to go to hell." As a 16-year-old kid, you can imagine what kind of impact this had on me and how much fear it instilled in me to ever look outside my religious upbringing. So the loss and grief of my father wasn't the only thing I had to deal with, but I also had to face these deep fears that I had from fundamentalist religion. I recently had a conversation with someone in the conscious men community who had a similar experience with the loss of his daughter a couple years ago. He was also wrapped up in a very fear-based fundamentalist Christian community where, in addition to dealing with grief and loss, there's condemnation and fear. Fortunately, he was very courageous and kind and gave me his consent to share our conversation with you. I truly believe that there is some healing medicine in this video for someone out there. Maybe that someone is you, whether you're dealing with some kind of grief or loss, or find yourself questioning the fundamentalist religion that you were raised with. It can be very scary once you start to grow into your own person and you start to question things and no longer resonate with certain beliefs, especially when you feel the energy of fear behind it. Regardless of your background, I think the well-known scripture of God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of love and power and a sound mind is very relevant in this day and age, but most of us miss it completely. All that being said, I would encourage you to listen to this conversation with an open mind and an open heart, and I hope you get something out of this. You are loved, you matter, and you've barely scratched the surface of what you're capable of. Here's the conversation. So anything that you want to ask, I'm just here to support and be of service, and I am an open book.
I have a lot of hang up with my daughter's death, and I'm going to try to speak as clinically as I can so I can maintain my composure. I was raised in fundamentalism, and until my daughter was about, she was in her, I don't know, around 14 or so, we started leaving fundamentalist Christianity, and started moving in a different direction. We were still in Christianity. By the time that we started getting out of that, the die had been cast and the damage was done. And one of the things I've learned about over the last 4 years, since I started really doing a deep dive into like alternative ways of thinking outside of the societally accepted mainstream religious and cultural group think, I came across like Nikola Tesla, and I'm going to get a little woo, so bear with me, but Nikola Tesla says that when you think of the universe, think in terms of energy, frequency, and vibration. And I started having some tuning fork work done on me for health purposes. It kind of goes hand in hand with like acupuncture and acupressure therapy. I have a point that I'm getting to with this. So everything has a frequency, and beliefs have a frequency. And I didn't find this out until a couple of years ago, but I think a lot of really fundamental religious beliefs have a pretty dense frequency. And
Yeah, they do.
a lot of times those express themselves in the body through various forms of disease, or like for me, for the last 30 years, I've had significant problems with my knees. And one of the reasons being is that like your right side, the right side of your body has to do with your mother, the left side of your body has to do with your father. And I would notice I would notice as I went through different experiences, one knee would be doing fine and the other knee was just jacked. Then that would clear up and the other one would flare up. And I noticed that it had um, it had conjunction with different difficult experiences that I was having with my parents. The reason I bring that up is because my daughter was diagnosed with a very, very rare, very aggressive form of ovarian cancer. And she was 20 when she was diagnosed with that. The reason that this is really connected with a lot of things is because her mom and I watched her struggle for many years to be saved. Like, but she would tell us, I just can't feel it. Um, Other people would have these glowing testimonies about how they accepted Jesus into their lives and their life changed and they didn't drink or smoke or swear anymore and all these different things. And so she would agonize and just, we watched her beat herself up for years because she couldn't feel it. And I really feel like the Christian faith that we were in gave her cancer. Because she was just constantly stressed out. I bring all that up to say that, grieving my daughter is not a straightforward thing, and it has a lot of anger in it. And one of the things that is really difficult for me to kind of soak into my being and move through. I haven't been able to move through this. And I feel responsible, but I also look at the Christian faith and all the people that taught her these things. I look at my family and I hold, I think I'm in direct conflict with my higher self at this point, and having a really difficult time alchemizing this whole situation, what's happened over the last 3 years with her getting sick and then dying. My higher self has forgiven my family for the part that they played in this, because they're all very, very full of their faith, and they believe that she's in hell. They haven't come out and said it to my face, but if you know, you know.
Yeah.
And so there's they weren't supportive of my daughter when she was going through her chemotherapy, and they weren't supportive of me and my her mom and her sister. So that was really difficult. So when I grieved my daughter, it's tied in with all that. It's not just a straightforward grieving my daughter. So when I have those moments where something trips me up, and I honor the emotion, but I've come to realize over the last couple of weeks that there's a lot that's going with that. It's not just missing my daughter. I think the Christian faith had a lot to do with my failed marriage.
Yeah.
So I guess the question I asked you was kind of straightforward, but it's really, really nuanced too, because I it's always easy to play the what if game. But going back to the question I asked you, do you still, I mean, how long did it take? Because I saw in one of your videos that you said, I think it was one of your car videos, that you said that you've healed from the loss of your dad. And
Yeah.
I've come to this point in my journey where I know that we are spiritual and physical beings. So we have this self that we reside in, but we also have a higher self. And so I guess my question is kind of multifaceted. How do you move through grief in a healthy way, is there ever an end to that? Um, and how do you balance that physically and spiritually? Because I want to honor those things, but at the same time, I don't know. I'm kind of taking this one day at a time. So, 10, 15 years from now, am I supposed to be in a different frame of mind?
Yeah.
And then I feel like the healthy dose of anger that I have toward like the Christian faith and my family's reaction to her sickness and eventual death and everything tied in with that. Not exactly sure how to transmute that. Um, and I would like to get to the point where I can just honor the emotions of grief for my daughter's death in a pure sense without all of the other, kind of riding on like barnacles
Yeah.
on a ship's hull. And I just wanted to pose that question to you and kind of open that topic because I know that you went through your own loss with your dad, and I'm sure a lot of that was tied in with the fundamentalist Christianity. And also I want to, get to the point where I can forgive myself.
Yeah.
Thoughts?
Yeah. Man, thank you so much for sharing all of that. And first thing I want to say is that I'm here with you, man. And I don't just mean that on a physical plane. I mean even on a spiritual level. You are not alone in this. And I'm gonna say some things. Just get grounded in your breath for a minute. Not saying that you aren't, but just deep low breaths and stuff. This kind of thing is not easy to share. It is not easy to be vulnerable and open up about these things, especially as a man. And grief, particularly, is a very tricky topic. In hindsight, now I have this quiet gratitude for the things that I had experienced and the suddenness of it, the tragicness of it, all of it, and also it being in the muck of fundamentalist Christianity. My father, he wrote me an individualized suicide letter before he took his life. And even in it, before his last dying breaths, wrote things in the letter like, keep believing in Jesus because I'm going to be looking for you in heaven, like all of these things, which I know he meant well, but the level of trauma that added to it on top of it, especially when I did start to awaken and have experiential moments with the divine, and I decided to step away from that Christianity. I still had this letter from my dad saying, make sure to follow Jesus. So that way you don't go to hell and you can find me in heaven, in his letter, in his suicide letter. And I also want to relate to, I remember getting a phone call from someone at our church. I don't remember who it was. And it was like a few days after he had passed, and we're like really struggling. And she asked me, "Oh, like how are you doing?" And I was just like, "Oh, I'm just taking it one day at a time. Like I know he's in a better place." And then she paused and then took like a big sigh, and she was like, "Well, I mean, you know what it says in scripture, like he did kill himself. So I don't know about that. And so here's the thing: not only did I have to go through the grieving of the loss of my father, but I was also in the muck of all of this fundamentalist religion at the same time. And so losing a child is different. Um, I've had meditations where all of a sudden to the surface, I imagined my son, my 4-year-old son, suddenly tragically dying. And I had been immersed in the weight of that feeling of losing him, almost like the divine was like, hey, even though this may not happen, I want you to feel the weight of this. And so I've had very deep meditations of, having that grief almost repurposed into imagining the loss of my son. And I think largely, Brian, that has even come about from some of our conversations and the loss that I know that you've been through. So it was about a week ago that, I had an experience like that in meditation. But as far as grief goes, firsthand from my experience, is that you're just going to grieve and you're going to grieve and you're going to grieve. And then those, it comes in waves. You'll be hit by these giant waves for maybe even, the first 5 years or so, these big waves, and then you'll think to yourself, is this ever going to stop? Is it ever going to slow down? And then it does. The space between the waves of grief, there's a little bit more space. It doesn't happen as often. And then now at the point where I'm at, I think the healing process was very slow for me, Brian, because I really wasn't as humble as you are in my search for truth until like much later after losing my dad. I do think that maybe having a deeper understanding of some of these spiritual truths would have helped me in the grieving process. But now over time, when I see that I'm healed, what happens is when those waves come, instead of it just being like this heavy grief of loss, of losing this person that I'll never have again, and it's like the mind has to go through all kinds of layers. I remember even like waking up in the middle of the night and I felt like I like could smell my dad's cologne and stuff like that, like in the house, and just being like, what's going on? All these different things. You really have to let the mind run its course with the grief. Just let it grieve and grieve, let everything come up to the surface with the knowing that there will be a point where in that grief, it will be replaced by this calm space, and that love that you felt for the person that you lost will be in the present somehow. It's almost like it never left. You'll feel it. There are moments where a wave will come, and instead of being grief, it feels like my father's presence, just the individual expression of the spark of the divine that he was. I like feel it in the room with me sometimes. And I'm just like, oh man. Essentially that love transcends death, essentially. And you kind of have to have those experiences to know it. I could say that. I could say, hey, love transcends death and all that. Nothing of value is ever truly lost. But that usually comes after layers and layers of grief. Be patient with yourself. It's very easy to get caught in the trap of like, oh, it's not spiritual to still feel all this after however many years goes by. You just need to let it all come to the surface, however long it takes. And I think that God's gift to us is that the grief comes in waves. Because I think if it all hit us at once, our puny human bodies and our puny human minds would just crush under the weight. So it's like bit by bit. And then eventually on the other side of that grief, I don't have any more feelings of grief. And I am curious at this stage, Brian, if I were to lose another loved one with this understanding that I now have, I think it would be very different. But I had to go through almost like 15 years of grief and anger, because I was also very angry. I was angry at how he died, the suddenness of it, the fundamentalist Christianity, the lack of love, and the ignorance that was, in all of that. But I will say too, there's that saying that there's grace in suffering, right? But an important distinction that I have actually learned is that suffering is actually grace, because I wouldn't be who I am today if I had not experienced those things. And there's even layers, depending on how deep into the mystical, esoteric, and spiritual you want to get. There's even concepts of like before we even incarnated, there was like contracts where it's like, okay, like I'm going to live, I'm going to I'm gonna live to this point and then I'm gonna die of this disease. And it's like, oh, I'm gonna live until this point, and then this person I love is gonna die from this disease. And from it, they're gonna learn this, and from it, I'm gonna learn this. But it's like that's such a zoomed out perspective. Sometimes it's even in a lot of ways almost disrespectful to even mention that perspective to someone who can't really like imagine that right now.
I want to respond to what you just said. One of the difficulties that I have, my inner knowing agrees with what you just said. And I have felt that for the better part of the last 2 years, that we do make a decision who we, our life plan before we incarnate. One of the reasons I'm talking to you about balancing the physical and the spiritual is because I think while I have that knowing, or my belief that we do choose our life plans before we come here, I'm almost angry with my higher self. Like, why the fuck would you let something like this happen? Why would you do something like this? And
Yeah.
I get that it's a child's perspective, coming to an understanding where I can blend the physical and the spiritual and make sense of it, because on one hand, she saved my life and has given me the opportunity to recognize things that if she hadn't been my daughter, I probably never would have come to a recognition of. But on the other hand, it's hard to square the reality of what happened to her. So there's a spiritual knowing and a physical knowing, and I don't live in the anger. I just recognize that it's there, and to be really honest, I want to move on from it. It's not something that's really helpful. I've moved on from the religion. My family and I, don't really have anything to do with
Yeah.
each other, but it's a difficult thing. It's almost like Jacob wrestling with God.
Yeah.
And I think that's where I'm at right now. And one of the difficulties that I'm having, and I've never been this way until I lost my daughter. I'm having a difficulty with, why bother? Because I didn't just lose her. I lost family and a faith and a daughter, but it's just kicked my legs out from underneath me, and I just don't really know what the purpose is to try to stand up again, move forward. I know there's a purpose. My mind knows that. My heart. It's a bit of a different story. It's a real paradox right now. And when I talk about my daughter, a lot of different things come up. My ex and I were on really good terms. My younger daughter, she's starting to do better, but with regards to my daughter dying and everything that goes along with that, like, it's difficult because it just is. I mean, I don't know.
Yeah.
I feel like I'm
Yeah.
stuck.
Well, let me say, man, real quick, let the paradox be there. Just bring an allowance and an acceptance to the paradox, and even all of the anger, because even like you just said, by her passing, it has brought out an authenticity out of you that would not have been possible. And I know that it's like, oh, but like if I had to have chosen, I would have chosen to keep the person as opposed to these other, so-called benefits like the authenticity and shedding different layers. But man, this is a version of a dark night of the soul. It really is. And nothing will purge and purify like grief and anger will. And it's just so very important to not resist it. in meditation, or whenever you're in a bout of grief and that wave is hitting you and you're in solitude, let it come to the surface, man, in any form and in any capacity that it needs to. Truly, I wouldn't say, do that in front of people, because then people might get scared. But for me, man, the amount of times that I have spent screaming into a pillow, punching the hell out of my couch, on a fetal position on the ground, just like crying so hard that I like ended up like vomiting. Those are the unsexy parts of being purified that people don't talk about. And it's almost like grief. If you can imagine the most intense, horrifying, like ayahuasca or a mushroom trip, sometimes life gives us like a real life physical version of that. And it's a dark night of the soul, man. It's what you're going through. And I would encourage you just not to not diminish it, because it is easy to bypass, especially like as we start to learn about spirituality and all these concepts. What's sometimes missing is the love aspect. The thought of like, the divine isn't just like this methodical thing where it's like, okay, so if this happens, then this thing will happen, and that's a good thing. It's all just like the amount of equanimity and love that's behind all of these things that happen is beyond what we can even comprehend. And I've had glimpses of it here and there. And whenever I get those glimpses and I get that brief moment of remembrance of like, oh, everything is okay and everything is so much more infinitely loving than I can even begin to comprehend with this physical brain of mine in this physical experience. And for a moment, I'm able to just like take a breath and everything's okay. And then that spaciousness eventually gets a little bit smaller again. And then I'm like back in sadness or back in grief. And that was kind of the cycle for me when I was grieving those intense losses, because it wasn't just the death of my father, it was the death of my entire worldview, my entire understanding of what I thought God was, my entire paradigm, essentially. It felt like I was dying also, because I was. And there was a piece of me dying. And so I felt like I wanted to die. I remember that very vividly when I had like suicidal ideations and things like that. In hindsight, there just was a piece of me that was ready to die, was begging me to die. And it felt like I wanted to die. But when I chose to stay and let those things run its course on the other side, there was that aspect of freedom. And it's what has led me, Brian, to this point right here and now, where we're able to have this conversation and I can hold space for you and I can see you and I can speak to you with no ego and just from a place of love. I can feel everything that you're feeling on a deep level, but I can hold space and I can keep it together and I can talk to you and be here with you. And you're going to be able to do that for other people if that's what you want. At the end of the day, it's like we still have the choice of the path we want to take, but these deeper truths are being presented to you, and the other part of you is angry, and all these things are coming to the surface. Just let it all come to the surface, man. And even by you being here and being able to open up and talk about these things, the suffering that you're experiencing, the days are numbered. You're not, this is the opposite of perpetuating suffering. You're going deeply into it. You're like, here it is, here I am. I'm just being completely honest, authentic, and vulnerable. And when you're coming from that place, its days are numbered. This will not be your reality forever.
Yeah, and I agree. This is not something that is constant. This,
Waves.
yes, it comes and goes. It doesn't come nearly as often as it did. And I know that I've had those moments where I recognize the greater good, if you will. I recognize the blessing in disguise, and I understand that there was a very, very clear reason why these things needed to happen. So those are moments of pure peace and moments that is a stage that I would like to get to experience on a far more frequent basis. I just became aware, just perhaps over the last couple of weeks, that a lot of other emotions are coming along with the grief for my daughter in ways that I had not recognized. And because of your background, I just wanted to get your perspective on that, and see what a little bit of what your journey was out of that. So I appreciate it.
A deep and long process of forgiveness, not just for myself, but fundamentalist Christianity as a whole. Because there was a time too where I would get very triggered by fundamentalist Christians. Like I'd get that feeling of hate, of resentment and hatred towards individuals. Where when I think back, my fundamentalist upbringing, Brian, in a lot of ways was actually a gift because it was my intro to even the understanding of an or the existence of a benevolent force outside of myself. There was a lot of good things to it. It wasn't all bad. I actually needed it to be a part of my journey. So eventually you will get to that point when the hindsight is clear enough and you'll find yourself being grateful for things that at one point you loathed and you hated. You'll be like, oh, I see why going through that allowed me to learn this lesson and to develop this level of understanding and patience and grace for these types of people and for myself. And whenever you do have those moments, though, of those mystical moments of infinite love or whatever it is, it's easy to almost become like a junkie where you're like always chasing those moments because they're so powerful. What I have found is those moments, more than anything, they're just an opportunity to integrate more, to remember, those moments, like journal about them furiously, voice memos, whatever you need to do. And then when you're in those darkest periods and you're like, I'm forgetting right now why anything is worthwhile or what the hell hope even is, you can crack open that journal and read it and be like, okay, that's right. And that's where I've gotten to now, to where my remembrance of the remembrance has gotten much better now. So even if there is a long period where I'm not having some kind of epic mystical moment where of pure clarity and bliss and understanding, I'm able to remember more clearly those moments. And I can get my mind on board a lot easier now. Because I can be like, hey, mind, remember this? And then it's like, oh, yeah, okay. And then my mind will get back in alignment with my heart and the divine without so much resistance anymore. So those moments are great, but it's easy to get into a loop of chasing those moments. And that's something I've had to surrender myself because I was a mystical experience junkie for a while because it's like, man, once you have a glimpse of that, and a taste of it, it's like all you want.
I'm thankful because those moments have taught me that the intense physical discomfort that I go through emotionally, they don't last. And there is a place not to escape to, but a place to go. It's essentially like visiting home. And when you go and visit home, it gets you through those moments. So I appreciate you sharing your perspective and your journey out of that. Thank you.
Yeah, man. Last thing I'll say is let the grieving run its course and let yourself feel homesick. Yeah, it's like this physical life, I think in the grand scope of eternity, if we truly realized how much of a drop in the bucket it was compared to the endlessness of you and the endlessness of me. It's just hard to see that when we're in it, when we're this wrapped up in the dream. So, but I'm sending you love, dude.
Thank you, man. I appreciate it.
Yeah.